A girl saves bear from barbed wire, then the beardo's shocking things to her. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The oath between human and bear. The cold wind sliced through the pinewood forest as Sarah carefully cut the steel wires tightly wrapped around Shadow's leg. The sharp scent of blood lingered in the air as the massive bear let out a low growl, its amber eyes flickering with both pain and wariness. Despite its weakness from blood loss, it never took its gaze off her. Sarah knew she was gambling with her life. If the bear felt threatened, a single swipe of its powerful claws could end her. But deep inside, she believed it understood that she was not the enemy. Breathing steadily, she whispered, "I just want to help you." Her hands trembled as she snipped the last wire. Instantly, Shadow yanked its leg free and roared, the sound echoing through the trees. Sarah instinctively stepped back, but instead of attacking, the bear collapsed, its breaths heavy and labored. She couldn't leave it here. If Shadow's wounds got infected, even a leader like him wouldn't survive the harsh winter. Sarah unzipped her backpack, pulling out a roll of bandages and antiseptic. Slowly, she approached, placing a gentle hand on its thick fur, feeling the warmth radiating from its massive body. Shadow flinched, but didn't resist. In that moment, something changed. An unspoken trust sparked between them. After bandaging the wounds, Sarah took a step back, watching. Shadow pushed itself to its feet with difficulty, staring at her as if etching her image into its memory. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest. Sarah stood there, listening as the heavy footsteps faded into the distance. A strange feeling settled in her heart, like an invisible thread had tied their fates together. The bears returned a few days later. While Sarah was stacking firewood with her grandfather, she felt an eerie sensation, like something was watching her from the edge of the woods. Looking up, she froze. Shadow was standing there, silent as a ghost. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 other bears stood behind him, each powerful in their own way. One bore a long scar down its side, another had darker fur than the rest. Sarah held her breath. She had heard the legends about Pinewood's bears, how powerful clans ruled the wilderness, protecting their land. But never had she seen a bear return after being rescued by a human. Shadow took a step forward and lowered his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Sarah slowly raised her hand, not to touch him, but as a silent response. In that moment she knew. Shadow no longer saw her as a stranger. She was part of his story now. The threat looms closer. News of the bear pack's presence didn't escape the notice of hunters. Their massive tracks in the snow soon attracted attention. One evening at the local diner, Sarah overheard 2 men talking. "That big bear is still alive. I swear it's the biggest beast I've ever seen. If we catch it, those exotic animal traders would pay a fortune." Sarah's stomach clenched. They were talking about Shadow. She had to do something. A race against danger that night, under a thick blanket of fog. Sarah grabbed her backpack and quietly slipped out of the house. She needed to warn Shadow. Her boots sank into the snow as she hurried through the forest, the wind howling around her. Fear gnawed at her, but she had no time for hesitation. Then she stopped. Ahead, bathed in pale moonlight, the bear pack stood atop a rocky ridge, as if they had been waiting for her. "They're coming for you," she whispered, knowing they couldn't understand her words. But Shadow locked eyes with her, and somehow, she knew he understood. A gunshot shattered the silence. Sarah spun around. 2 hunters stood at the base of the hill, their rifles raised. A deafening roar split the air. Shadow charged before Sarah could react. A blur of dark fur, muscles rippling with raw power, a force of nature unleashed. One hunter turned and ran. The other barely had time to lift his weapon before Shadow knocked him to the ground. But Shadow didn't kill him. He stood over the man towering, growling, a living nightmare. Sirens pierced the night. Sarah's grandfather had called the police, and they arrived just in time. The two hunters were arrested that night. But when the officers turned to look for the bears, they were gone, vanished into the forest like whispers in the wind. A promise by the stream the next morning. As Sarah walked along the stream, she noticed something unusual. A deep claw mark etched into the frozen ground, right beside her footprints from the night before. It wasn't random. It was a sign. She knelt down, tracing the mark with her fingertips, a small smile forming. Shadow may have disappeared into the wilderness, but she knew they would always be watching over each other. And one day, their paths would cross again. The Guardian and the Shadows. The first time Sarah truly realized Shadow was watching over her was on a late autumn afternoon. She had ventured deeper into the pinewood forest than usual, sketchbook in hand, tracking the last golden hues before winter swallowed the landscape. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and aside from the occasional rustle of leaves, the woods were silent. She was lost in her drawing when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, but when she glanced up, her heart clenched. A mountain lion. It was crouched on a rocky ledge a few yards away, its golden eyes locked onto her. She could see the tense muscles beneath its tawny fur, the way its tail flicked in slow, calculated movements. It was deciding whether she was prey. Sarah's breath hitched. She knew not to run. That would only trigger the lion's instincts. Slowly, she reached for the hunting knife her grandfather had given her, though she knew it was a feeble defense against a predator that could kill with a single pounce. Then, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. From the shadows of the underbrush, a massive figure emerged. Shadow. He was larger than life, his thick fur bristling eyes glowing like molten gold. He stepped between Sarah and the mountain lion, shoulders squared, teeth bare. A silent warning. The lion hesitated. It knew better than to challenge a fully grown grizzly, especially one as formidable as Shadow. With a final swish of its tail, it turned and vanished into the trees. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Shadow turned toward her, watching intently. You saved me," she whispered. He made no sound, but something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words. And then, just as silently as he had come, he disappeared into the forest once more. A silent pact from that day forward, Sarah knew. Shadow wasn't just watching her. He was protecting her. It wasn't only him, either. His pack, 3 other massive bears, each with their own scars and stories, began appearing in the periphery of her vision. She would catch glimpses of them moving between trees when she walked the trails near her grandfather's cabin. Sometimes she'd hear the heavy crunch of paws on fallen leaves, just far enough away to remind her she wasn't alone. Yet they never approached, never intruded, only watched. Her grandfather noticed, too. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, he exhaled a long breath and said, "Bears don't do that, Sarah." She looked at him. "What do you mean? They don't follow people. Not like this." "Not unless—" he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Not unless they see you as one of their own." A shiver ran down her spine. A threat in the woods one night, everything changed. Sarah was returning from town late, the sky inky black above her. The only sound the crunch of her boots on the gravel road leading to their cabin. Her grandfather had let her take the truck, but she'd parked it at the foot of the hill and decided to walk the last stretch home. The woods were quiet, almost unnervingly so. That's when she heard it. The low murmur of voices. She stopped, heart pounding. Peering through the trees, she spotted 2 men crouched near the chicken coop behind her grandfather's cabin. One of them held a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other was fiddling with the latch of the coupe. Poachers? Sarah's hands curled into fists. She had heard about illegal hunting rings operating near Pinewood, but she never thought they would come this close. She reached for her phone, ready to call her grandfather, when a sound cut through the night, a deep, resonant growl. Sarah barely had time to react before a massive shadow moved between the trees. Shadow emerged from the darkness like a force of nature. The men froze. One of them cursed, stumbling back. "Holy hell! It's that bear!" The one with the rifle hissed. Shadow advanced, slow and deliberate, his breath misting in the cold air. He wasn't attacking. He was warning. But the poacher didn't take the warning. Sarah saw the man's hand move toward his rifle strap, and before she could think, she stepped forward. "Don't!" Her voice was steady, though her heart was anything but. The men whirled to face her. "Kid, this isn't your business," the second man sneered. "You want to get involved." "I already am." She looked at Shadow, then back at the men. "And you should leave." The one with the rifle hesitated. The bear was too close, too big. If he tried anything, he wouldn't make it out of the woods in one piece. The fight for the wild Sarah first heard the name Westridge Resources during a heated town meeting at Pinewood's community center. The room was packed. Local business owners, ranchers, environmentalists, and families all gathered under the dim fluorescent lights, their voices a mix of concern and frustration. At the front of the room stood Richard Westridge, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life. His suit was crisp, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, and his smile, a polished politician's smile, never faltered. "We're offering Pinewood something it desperately needs," Westridge said smoothly, gesturing toward a large poster displaying plans for the mine expansion. "Jobs, economic stability. This town has struggled since the timber mill shut down. We're here to bring prosperity back." Sarah's grandfather, William, stood near the back of the room, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could feel the tension rolling off him. Prosperity at what cost? Officer Parker challenged from the front row. He had been Pinewood's conservation officer for over a decade, a man who understood the land better than anyone. That expansion zone isn't just empty land. It's home to a fragile ecosystem, to wildlife that's already struggling to survive. Westridge barely blinked. "We've done our environmental assessments. Any impact will be minimal." Sarah felt her hands tighten into fists. Minimal? She had hiked those woods since she was a child. She had seen the dens, the bear tracks in the mud, the salmon runs that fed them. She knew what would happen if Westridge's company tore through that land. She looked at her grandfather. He nodded, giving her silent permission. Sarah stood. "Your company's expansion cuts right through Shadow's territory," she said, her voice carrying through the tense room. "That's not just some empty stretch of land. It's home to one of the last stable grizzly populations in this region." A murmur spread through the crowd. "Miss Miller," Westridge turned his charming smile on her, though she could see the calculation behind it. "I appreciate your concern, but grizzlies are resilient animals. They'll find new territory." "No, they won't." Sarah stepped forward. "You might think you're just digging into the ground, but you're tearing apart an ecosystem that's already on the brink. If you force the bears out, they won't just move. They'll starve. They'll wander into town. They'll be shot as nuisances. You're not just expanding a mine. You're killing them." The room fell silent. Richard Westridge studied her, his smile never quite fading. But his eyes hardened. Sarah could feel it. She had just made an enemy. Shadow knows that night. Sarah sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The autumn wind had a sharp bite, rustling the trees at the edge of the forest. Somewhere in the darkness, she felt them before she saw them. A pair of glowing amber eyes blinked from between the trees. Shadow. She didn't move, didn't call out. She simply waited. A moment later, he stepped forward, his massive form emerging from the darkness. Behind him, 3 other grizzlies lingered, his pack. The moonlight caught the jagged scar along his shoulder, a mark left from the poacher's trap she had freed him from months ago. Shadow huffed, nostrils flaring. His eyes never left hers. "I know," she whispered. "I know what they're trying to do." The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of oil and metal, unnatural things that didn't belong in the forest. Shadow's ears flicked toward the trees. He knew something was wrong. The bears knew, and so did she. An ominous discovery the next morning. Sarah didn't go to school. Instead, she packed her sketchbook, a camera, and a hunting knife and set off into the woods. Her grandfather didn't stop her. He knew better. She followed Shadow's trails, the paths she had memorized over the years. The deeper she went, the less familiar land became. Then she saw it. Orange survey markers. Dozens of them, driven into the dirt. She crouched, running her fingers over one of the wooden stakes. It was fresh, too fresh. Something crunched behind her. She spun, heart hammering, only to see Shadow standing on a rise just beyond the clearing. He was watching her, but his ears were pinned back, his posture tense. He was angry. That's when Sarah noticed the metallic stench in the air. She followed the scent, weaving between the trees, stepping carefully over tangled roots and moss-covered stones. The smell grew stronger. A sharp, acrid stink that made her stomach turn. And then she saw it. A dead deer, half submerged in the river. But it wasn't killed by a predator. The water around it was unnatural, tinged with a faint oily sheen, contaminated. Sarah's blood ran cold. The mining company wasn't just planning to expand. They had already started, exposing the truth. Sarah ran. She didn't stop until she reached Officer Parker's office, breathless and shaking. She dumped her camera onto his desk, flipping through the images, the survey markers, the poisoned water, the dead deer. "This isn't just some proposal," she said, voice trembling with fury. "They're already working out there, illegally." Parker leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Damn it," he muttered. "We need to get this in front of the town council." He grabbed his phone, dialing the mayor. Sarah's hands curled into fists. She wouldn't let them take Shadow's land. She wouldn't let them poison these woods. Westridge had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. And that was going to cost him. The war begins the fight, for Pinewood's wilderness had just begun. And Sarah? She was ready. The betrayal within Michael Westridge wasn't sure when he had first begun doubting his father. Perhaps it was when he overheard a hushed phone call. The clipped tone in Richard Westridge's voice as he ordered a permit pushed through despite clear environmental risks. Or maybe it was when he read an internal report from Westridge Resources' own geologists, warning that the mine expansion would cause water contamination and destabilization of the land, only to find the official report submitted to regulators had been edited, the warnings conveniently removed. He had always known his father was ruthless, but this was criminal. And now, standing in Sarah's grandfather's cabin, watching her spread maps, photos, and printed reports across the wooden dining table, Michael knew he had crossed a line he could never come back from. "Here," Sarah said, pushing a printed email toward him. "I found this in the Public Records Archive. It's from one of the state environmental inspectors, asking why the water quality tests were never included in the final report." Michael read the email, his stomach twisting. "My father must have paid someone off," he muttered. Sarah nodded grimly. "And now, they're already working in the expansion zone, before they even have the full approval." Michael exhaled sharply. He had seen the signs himself. Construction equipment being staged, trees felled at the edges of Shadow's territory. His father wasn't waiting for legal permission. "All right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to blow this open before he can finish." William, Sarah's grandfather, leaned back in his chair, studying Michael with a careful gaze. "You understand what you're doing, son?" the older man said. "You're going against your father. If this goes public, you're going to be cut off from everything." Michael hesitated. For a brief second, he thought of his childhood. The vacations in private resorts, the expensive schools, the life of wealth and privilege his father had built. A life he had never questioned, until now. Then he thought of the wolves, the poisoned water, the land his father was destroying for profit. Michael met William's gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "And I don't care." Sarah gave him a small, approving nod. The evidence they needed. Their next move was dangerous. Michael knew his father kept physical copies of sensitive documents in his private office. Files he didn't trust to store digitally, fearing hackers or leaks. If they could get inside, they could find contracts, bribery records, altered reports, everything they needed to expose Westridge resources. "We have one chance," Michael said as he pulled out a blueprint of his father's office. "He's meeting with the county commissioner tomorrow. That gives us about 2 hours before he comes back." Sarah nodded, already pulling on a dark jacket and gloves. "Then let's get to work." Breaking in, it was raining when they reached Westridge Resources' main office, a small but heavily secured building in the heart of Pinewood. The security cameras were motion-activated, but Michael knew their blind spots. Moving carefully, they slipped in through a side entrance, using Michael's copied keycard. The hallway was silent, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and paper. Michael led Sarah toward his father's office, heart pounding in his chest. "If they got caught—" "Here," he whispered, unlocking the office door. They stepped inside. Sarah wasted no time. She went straight to the file cabinet, rifling through folders, receipts, contracts. Michael booted up his father's computer, inserting a flash drive to copy any digital records. Then he saw it. An email chain, his father discussing expedited negotiations with a state official in charge of environmental permits. Michael scrolled through, his breath hitching. His father had bribed regulators to approve the expansion, knowing it would lead to landslides, poisoned rivers, and destroyed habitats. He hit download. "Sarah," he whispered, "we've got it." But before she could respond, the overhead lights flicked on. A voice cut through the silence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Michael's blood ran cold. Richard Westridge stood in the doorway. Behind him, 2 security guards stepped forward. Michael and Sarah were trapped. Richard's face was unreadable, calm, almost amused. "You know, son," he said smoothly, "I always knew you were—" Sarah's fist clenched. "We have proof," she said, her voice steady. "You bribed officials. You're poisoning this town," Richard sighed, shaking his head. "Michael," he said, turning to his son, "walk away, right now. Forget this childish rebellion. Come back home, and I'll pretend this never happened." Michael hesitated. He could feel Sarah's gaze on him, waiting for his choice. His father was offering him a way out, one that would let him keep his family, his wealth, his old life. But that life wasn't his anymore. He turned toward Sarah. "Run." Before she could react, he grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and threw it at the lights, shattering them. The room plunged into darkness. Sarah didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the side door, clutching the files she had taken. Michael slammed into one of the guards, knocking him off balance. Richard's voice roared through the chaos. "Get them!" Sarah burst into the hallway, sprinting toward the exit. Footsteps thundered behind her. Security closing in. Security closing in. She reached the back door, shoved it open, rain slamming into her face, and dove into the forest. Seconds later, Michael caught up to her, behind them. Richard's furious voice rang out. "You're making a mistake, boy!" Michael didn't look back. He had already made his choice. Running with the wolves, they ran through the dark forest, their breath ragged. But Sarah knew these woods. She knew how to move, how to disappear. And she knew where to go. After what felt like hours, they slowed, finally collapsing against a fallen tree. Thunder rumbled overhead. Michael wiped rain and sweat from his face. We need to get to Parker. He's the only one we can trust. Sarah nodded. Tomorrow morning, we'll bring everything. Then, from the trees, a shape emerged. Shadow. His massive form was barely visible in the darkness, but his eyes gleamed, watching them. Behind him, the rest of the bear pack lurked in the shadows. They had been waiting. Sarah met Shadow's gaze. We're in trouble, she whispered. The great bear huffed, stepping forward. And somehow, Sarah knew, Shadow had seen the danger. And he wasn't going to let them fight alone. The reckoning in the storm, Sarah awoke to the rhythmic sound of wind howling through the trees. The world around her was a blur of white, a blizzard raging with unrelenting fury. But she was warm. Not from her own strength, her body had given up hours ago, but from them. Shadow's massive form pressed against her side, his thick fur radiating heat. Around them, the rest of the bear pack had formed a living barrier against the cold, their immense bodies shielding her from the worst of the storm. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious. But as she stirred, Shadow lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. Sarah's lips were cracked, her breath shallow, but she forced out the words, barely a whisper. They're coming. Shadow exhaled, a visible puff of steam escaping his nostrils. He already knew. Somehow, deep in his instincts, he understood that the forest, their home, was under attack. Sarah had risked her life to warn them about the hunters Westridge Resources had sent, men paid to eliminate anything standing in the way of the company's expansion. And now, the battle was about to begin. The hunt begins. A gunshot rang out, distant, but close enough to send every bear in the pack snapping to attention. Sarah's heart pounded. They were here. The storm had slowed them down, but it hadn't stopped them. Shadow rose to his full height, towering over her. The other bears followed suit, shaking off the snow that had gathered on their backs. Sarah struggled to sit up, her limbs stiff with cold. We have to move, she croaked. They'll track us. Shadow let out a low growl, a deep, resonating sound that sent the message rippling through the pack. And then, they moved. A deadly chase. Sarah staggered through the snow, her legs weak, but her mind sharp. She knew these woods, every ridge, every frozen stream, every hiding place, but the hunters were close. She heard their voices now, shouting over the wind. They're heading east. Cut them off at the ravine. Sarah's stomach clenched. The ravine. If the bears were forced toward it, they'd be trapped. Too steep to climb down, too wide to leap across. She turned to Shadow, desperation in her eyes. Not that way, she urged. We have to lead them west, toward the old logging road. The massive bear hesitated, then huffed, understanding. The pack veered westward, plunging deeper into the trees. But the hunters weren't fools. A second gunshot cracked through the night, and one of the younger bears roared in pain, stumbling. No! Sarah gasped. The bear was still standing, but bleeding, its thick fur matted with dark crimson. The sight ignited something in Shadow. The great bear turned, fury radiating from his massive frame. He was done running. The standoff the pack stopped. The hunters emerged from the trees, their rifles raised. There were 4 of them, dressed in heavy winter gear, faces hidden behind ski masks. But Sarah recognized the leader, a man named Cole Thatcher, one of Westridge's hired guns. Well, well, Thatcher sneered. What do we have here? A girl and her little pets. Sarah clenched her fists. They're not pets. And you have no right to be here, Thatcher chuckled. I have every right. This land, it belongs to Westridge Resources now. He gestured at the bears. And these things, they're just obstacles. He raised his rifle. Don't! Sarah warned, stepping forward. Thatcher's eyes gleamed. Or what? Before he could react, a dark blur moved. Shadow. The bear lunged, not at Thatcher, but at the rifle, striking it aside with a powerful swipe of his claws. The weapon skidded into the snow. Chaos erupted. The bears charged, their deep roars shaking the air. The hunters scrambled backward, firing wildly, but the storm and the sheer power of the pack sent them stumbling. Sarah dove behind a fallen log, her breath ragged. Shadow knocked one of the men to the ground, his claws barely missing flesh. He wasn't killing them, but he was making sure they remembered. One of the hunters fled outright, disappearing into the trees. The others, disarmed, terrified, outmatched. Thatcher lay in the snow, gasping for breath, staring up at Shadow, whose massive form loomed over him. For a long moment, everything was silent, except for the wind and the ragged breathing of the defeated hunters. Then Shadow huffed and stepped back. Sarah took a breath and rose. "This forest doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice steady. "And neither do these bears." Thatcher sat up slowly, humiliated, furious. "This isn't over," he spat. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Yeah, it is." She turned to Shadow. "Let's go." A new dawn by the time they reached safer ground. The storm had begun to clear. Sarah's body ached, exhaustion weighing her down. But the sight of the rising sun over the snow-covered trees filled her with relief. The bears had survived. She had survived. But more than that, the hunters had been stopped. For now. Sarah turned to Shadow, watching as he surveyed the land, the territory he had sworn to protect. She knelt beside him, resting a gentle hand on his thick fur. "They're going to back," she murmured. "We both know that." Shadow didn't react. He simply stared ahead, his deep eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned, nudging his forehead against her shoulder. A silent promise. They would fight together. Inferno and betrayal. The sky over Pinewood turned a sickly shade of orange as thick plumes of black smoke billowed into the sky. The air was filled with the acrid stench of burning wood and scorched earth. The fire had started near the Westridge Resources mining site, but it had spread far beyond their control, devouring the dry underbrush like a ravenous beast. Sarah stood at the edge of town, heart pounding, watching as the inferno crept closer. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, fire crews scrambling to contain the flames. But even from here, she knew it was too late. The fire was moving too fast. A hand landed on her shoulder. "Michael, we have to get to the town meeting," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "People need to know what's really happening." Sarah nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Shadow, the bears. Where were they? Had they made it to safety? A town in crisis, the Pinewood Community Hall was packed. Every resident had gathered, their voices panicked, angry, desperate. Mayor Jackson, standing at the front of the room, raised his hands for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation," he announced. "The fire has already burned through over 5,000 acres, and it's still spreading. Firefighters are doing all they can, but we need to prepare for possible evacuation." Shouts erupted. "What caused it? How do we know it won't reach the town? Why weren't we warned sooner?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and sharp. "We were warned." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her. "The bears knew before any of us," she continued. "Shadow's pack saw the fire before it reached town. They knew something was wrong." Some people murmured in agreement. Others scoffed. "Bears don't predict fires," one man snapped. "This is ridiculous," Michael cut in, his voice cold and furious. "This isn't just a fire." He held up his phone, showing an email thread with the Westridge Resources logo at the top. This was caused by Westridge's negligence. They were warned about fire hazards near their equipment weeks ago, and they ignored it. Gasps filled the room. Mayor Jackson paled. That's a serious accusation. Michael glared at him. It's not an accusation. It's the truth. Sarah took a deep breath. And there's something else, she said. This isn't the only fire. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. What do you mean? Someone asked. Shadow had shown her the truth. What do you mean? Someone asked. Shadow had shown her that. When the fire started, I followed the bears, she said. They led me to the North Ridge, and I saw it. Another fire. This wasn't one accident. Someone set a second fire to drive the animals out of their territory. The room exploded in angry voices. Who would do that? Are you saying it was intentional? Westridge Resources. Who else? The mayor raised his hands again. But this time, his voice shook. We don't have proof of that. Michael turned to him. Then let's go find it. Into the inferno an hour later, Sarah, Michael, and Officer Parker stood at the edge of the burning forest. It was madness to go in. But they had to. We need evidence, Michael said, adjusting his mask. If Westridge set that second fire, we have to prove it before they cover it up. Sarah's gaze swept over the landscape. Trees reduced to skeletal husks, embers glowing in the distance. We're not alone, she murmured. Michael frowned. What? Before she could answer, a deep guttural sound echoed through the burning forest. A roar, and then they emerged. Shadow and the bears. Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was alive. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, the other bears moved like ghosts through the smoke. Their massive forms outlined in firelight. Michael stiffened. They stayed? Sarah swallowed. They were protecting something. Shadow let out a deep huff, turning toward a ridge of boulders. The exact place Sarah had seen the second fire. Come on, she whispered. They followed the bears. The truth in the ashes at the top of the ridge. They found it. Metal drums, charred, melted, but still recognizable. Sarah's stomach dropped. Fuel barrels. Michael's face twisted in rage. They set this fire on purpose. Officer Parker knelt, brushing away soot from one of the barrels. A logo was barely visible. Westridge Resources. Sarah's fists clenched. They didn't just ignore the fire hazards. They created them. Michael pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures. This is the proof we need. A gunshot rang out. Sarah flinched, instinctively ducking behind Shadow's massive form. Down below, figures moved in the smoke. Cole Thatcher. Cole Thatcher, and two more men, rifles in hand. Thatcher's voice carried over the crackling fire. You just can't stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, can you? Michael stood tall. We have everything we need to shut you down. Thatcher smirked. No, you don't. He raised his rifle. And Shadow charged. The final battle. Thatcher had no time to react. Shadow hit him like a train, knocking him to the ground. His rifle skidded away, lost in the embers. One of his men fired wildly, but the shot went wide. Then, the bears attacked, not to kill, but to end it. Sarah watched as Shadow pinned Thatcher down, his claws digging into the dirt mere inches from his throat. The other bears cornered the two remaining hunters, their deep growls vibrating through the air. Thatcher's eyes were wild with terror. Call them off! Sarah stepped forward. Why? Afraid. Thatcher gulped. You wouldn't let them kill me. She stared at him, her face like stone. You nearly killed an entire town. Michael stepped aside her, holding up his phone. And now, everyone will know. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Officer Parker smirked. "Time's up, Thatcher." A new beginning. By the next morning, the fires were under control. The town had evidence. Westridge Resources was finished. As Sarah stood on the ridge, watching the first light break through the smoke, Shadow moved beside her. She reached out, resting her hand on his thick fur. "We did it," she whispered. Shadow huffed, his deep eyes reflecting something she could only describe as understanding. But she knew. This wasn't just a victory. It was a warning. Because some battles don't end, and some things are always worth protecting, together. Legacy of Shadow. The forest stood in eerie silence, the air thick with the scent of charred earth and lingering smoke. The once vibrant wilderness had been reduced to a skeleton of blackened trees, their twisted forms reaching skyward like mourning figures frozen in time. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the smoldering remains of the ridge, the place where Shadow had made his final stand. Her chest felt hollow, her breath shallow, but she refused to cry. Not yet. He was gone, but his legacy would not end here. A soft rustling behind her pulled her back to the present. She turned to see the rest of the bear pack, watching from a distance. They had stayed even after losing their leader. Shadow had protected them until the very end, and now it was her turn. A town in mourning. The news of Shadow's sacrifice spread through Pinewood like wildfire. For the first time in the town's long history, people weren't talking about bears as threats. They were talking about them as heroes. At the town square, Sarah stood beside Michael and Officer Parker, surrounded by Pinewood's residents. Mayor Jackson had resigned in disgrace, and his replacement, Eleanor Chin, had called for an emergency town meeting. "We owe our survival to more than just our firefighters," Eleanor said, her voice steady yet emotional. "Without the bears, without Shadow, we may not have discovered the second fire in time. And for that, we must rethink everything." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Frank Wilson, the once staunch anti-wildlife advocate, stepped forward, rubbing his chin. "I used to think bears were nothing but trouble," he admitted. "But that big one, Shadow, he saved my nephew's life when the fire spread near our ranch. I saw it with my own eyes." Others nodded, sharing their own stories. The tide was turning. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped forward. "We have a chance to do something different," she said. "Instead of fighting against the wild, we can learn to live alongside it. Shadow gave his life for this town. Let's not let that be in vain." The town fell silent, absorbing her words. Then Eleanor took a deep breath. "I propose we petition the state to protect this land. No more mining, no more destruction. Instead, we honor the bears and the forest by turning it into a wildlife conservation area." The response was immediate. Applause. Cheers. For the first time in decades, Pinewood was choosing preservation over profit. The fight for protection, of course, change didn't come easily. Despite the town's decision, Westridge Resources wasn't going down without a fight. Their lawyers flooded the courts with appeals, claiming the mining expansion was critical for the region's economy. Richard Westridge himself, though disgraced, still had powerful connections trying to salvage what was left of his crumbling empire. Michael, however, had a plan. "We need to prove that this land is too valuable to destroy," he told Sarah one evening as they pored over maps and documents. "Not just because of the bears, but because of everything that lives here." Sarah thought of Shadow's pack, the deer, the foxes, the rivers teeming with life. "I know exactly how to do that," she said. A living monument. Over the next several months, Sarah and Michael worked tirelessly. They teamed up with biologists and conservationists, documenting every species still inhabiting the fire-ravaged land. Using trail cameras and drone footage, they created a compelling case. One that showed not just the devastation of the fire, but the resilience of the wilderness. Footage of Shadow's pack, now led by a young male Sarah had named Ember, became the centerpiece of their campaign. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah stepped forward at a state environmental hearing, facing a panel of officials. She took a deep breath and held up a photograph, a still frame of Shadow taken months before the fire. "This bear," she said, voice unwavering, "was once seen as a monster, a threat. But he saved lives. He fought for this land harder than any of us ever did. And now we have a choice. Do we let his sacrifice mean nothing? Or do we finally do what's right?" Silence. Then, one by one, the officials nodded. By the end of the hearing, it was official. The Shadow Bear Wildlife Reserve was born. Closure and hope. Months later, Sarah stood at the edge of the reserve, gazing at the recovering forest. The scars of the fire remained, but new growth had begun. Green shoots pushing through the ash, proving that life always found a way. Behind her, the town had changed. Pinewood was no longer a place of fear and division. It had become a sanctuary, a town that had embraced its wild heart. And in the forest, the bears remained. As Sarah turned to leave, she felt it, the presence of something watching. She looked back. At the tree line, Ember stood, his massive form partially hidden by the brush. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Sarah knew. Shadow was gone, but his legacy lived on, and she would protect it. Always. The fall of Westridge Resources' winter had just begun to lay its frosty veil over Pinewood, when Sarah and Michael stepped into the county government office. In their hands, they carried the evidence they had spent months risking everything to uncover. Proof of Richard Westridge's crimes and his company's calculated destruction. Sarah looked down at the documents, her grip tightening. This wasn't just evidence against a greedy businessman. This was proof that he had been willing to set the forest ablaze, endangering thousands of lives, all for profit. Michael took a deep breath and pushed the heavy wooden door open. Inside, Sheriff Parker, the district attorney, and several county officials were waiting for them. "What do you have to present?" District Attorney James Holloway eyed them over his glasses, his expression unreadable. Without hesitation, Michael placed the documents on the desk. "This is evidence that my father deliberately caused the wildfire to accelerate illegal mining operations," Michael declared, his voice steady. A heavy silence fell over the room as the district attorney flipped through the pages. Unapproved mining expansion maps, falsified environmental impact reports, handwritten notes from Richard Westridge instructing safety measures to be ignored for the sake of speed. And then the final damning line, scrawled just days before the fire. "The risk is manageable. If a fire starts, even better. We need an excuse to move forward." Sheriff Parker gritted his teeth, slamming his fist onto the table. "Damn it. He did this on purpose." District Attorney Holloway leaned back in his chair, his gaze darkening. "This is more than enough for an indictment." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, a flicker of hope finally breaking through the months of struggle. Arrest in the storm. 2 days later, Richard Westridge was arrested at his mansion, caught in the season's first blizzard. Sarah and Michael watched from a distance as a special task force stormed the estate, handcuffing him in front of news cameras and reporters. "You can't do this to me," Richard roared. But no one cared about his desperate, hollow protests anymore. He had lost. Westridge Resources was immediately shut down. All mining projects were halted, and the town of Pinewood was officially freed from its grip. The mark of justice. Even though victory had been secured, the scars left behind by Richard's actions would not heal overnight. The forest still bore the blackened wounds of the wildfire. The bear pack, though adapting, was missing its leader. And for Sarah, the absence of Shadow was a void that nothing could ever fill. But she refused to let grief consume her. Alongside Michael, Sheriff Parker, and a group of conservationists, Sarah embarked on a new mission: restoring the forest. They secured funding from wildlife organizations, bringing in scientists to study how best to regenerate the ecosystem. Former miners, once employed by Westridge Resources, joined the efforts, helping plant thousands of saplings to regrow what had been lost. Slowly, green returned. A historic conservation conference 6 months later, Sarah and Michael stood on the stage of the Montana State Conservation Summit. Before them sat hundreds of officials, scientists, and journalists. Sarah looked out at the audience, then up at the large screen behind her, where a picture of Shadow was displayed. She took a deep breath, then began. We often believe that humans and nature are two separate worlds, but Pinewood's story has proven otherwise. She told the audience about Shadow, about how a hunted bear had become the protector of an entire town. By the time she finished, the hall erupted in applause. But what touched Sarah the most was when a veteran conservationist approached her, clasped her hand, and said, "You didn't just save the forest. You changed the way we see nature." Sarah smiled, a quiet whisper forming in her heart. "We did it, Shadow." A new spring a year later, something miraculous happened. As Sarah walked through the newly protected reserve, where the land had once been devastated, she heard a familiar sound. A deep, rumbling growl. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. At the edge of the trees, a massive, dark-furred bear stood watching her. It wasn't Shadow, but it was from his pack, and beside it, a tiny cub peeked out from behind a tree. Sarah smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not out of sorrow, but out of hope. A new spring had come, and Shadow's legacy would live on. Shadow Preserve, the legacy of a silent guardian. The first autumn after Westridge Resources collapsed brought a profound transformation to Pinewood. Gone were the convoys of mining equipment, the forged reports concealing environmental destruction, and the looming shadow of corporate greed. The town was healing in ways no one had imagined. The beginning of a legacy. Sarah stood on a ridge overlooking the forest, once on the verge of destruction from the flames born of human greed. Now, fresh green shoots were pushing through the charred earth. Birds had begun to return, and deer cautiously emerged from the tree line. "Everything is growing back," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the creek where Shadow had first appeared. The Shadow Bear Wilderness Preserve, named after the silent guardian of the forest, had been officially established following a unanimous vote from the town. Instead of relying on resource extraction, Pinewood had chosen a different path, one of conservation, respect, and coexistence with nature. Michael, who had once stood in his father's shadow before making his own choices, glanced at Sarah. "When I was younger, I thought a forest was just trees," he admitted. "Now I understand. It's an entire world." Sarah smiled. "And now, we're responsible for protecting it." Resistance against change. Although the decision to create the Shadow Preserve was widely supported, not everyone was happy. A handful of investors and former mining supporters were determined to fight back. Some began lobbying state officials, searching for any loophole that would allow them to restart resource extraction on unprotected lands. A heated town meeting took place, where two opposing factions, those who supported the preserve and those who wanted mining to return, clashed. "We can't just rely on tourism and conservation," one man shouted. "This town needs jobs. Not at the cost of destroying the only thing that makes Pinewood special," Sarah countered firmly. "We can develop without destruction. The preserve can become a research hub, bringing scientists, visitors, and conservationists to our town." Silence followed. No one could argue against that. At last the town council voted again. And this time, the protection of the forest became permanent law. But Sarah hadn't realized there were other dangers lurking in the shadows. The poachers arrive a month later. Signs of illegal poaching began appearing. Sarah discovered a metal trap near the preserve's boundary. There were tracks in the mud, evidence that someone had entered the forest at night. "They won't give up so easily," she told Michael and Sheriff Parker. "Not everyone respects the sanctuary, and some will do anything for money." Then, one night, a gunshot echoed through the trees. Sarah bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. Outside her grandfather's cabin, she saw the flickering glow of flashlight beams moving through the darkness. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and rushed into the night, quickly sending Michael a text. "Poachers in the forest. Meet me at the lookout." Confronting the trespassers, Sarah moved swiftly through the trees, her footsteps silent on the damp earth. As she reached a clearing, she heard voices. Low, hushed tones. "Did the trap catch anything?" One man asked. "No bear yet, but we got a deer. Think anyone noticed? We paid good money to be here. No one's kicking us out." Sarah clenched her fists, anger surging through her veins. These men didn't just break the law. They believed they were above it. Before she could move closer, a deep growl rumbled from the darkness. A wave of primal fear ran down Sarah's spine. From the depths of the forest, a massive shadow emerged. A towering black bear, its fur glistening under the faint moonlight. The poachers froze. "Bear!" one of them gasped. The bear didn't charge, but it didn't back down either. Sarah recognized it immediately. One of Shadow's young cubs, now fully grown. It was no longer the helpless creature she had once seen. It was a protector of the land. Just then, Michael and Sheriff Parker burst onto the scene, weapons drawn. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons, hands in the air," Parker ordered. The poachers turned to flee, but they didn't get far. Within minutes, they were apprehended. Sheriff Parker cuffed the leader, his voice laced with contempt. "You thought you could come into the preserve and do as you please?" The man lowered his head, knowing there was no escape. Shadow's legacy lives on as the chaos died down. Sarah turned back toward the bear that had protected the forest tonight. It stood at the tree line, watching her. Then, with a low, rumbling growl, it turned and disappeared into the night, back into the wild. Sarah exhaled slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. The bears were still here. They were still watching over the forest, and so would she, ensuring that Shadow's legacy would never be forgotten. The revival of the forest, a new bear pack, and a message from the past 2 years after that fateful night, when Shadow's bear pack vanished into the flames. The Shadow Bear Wilderness Preserve had become a symbol of resilience and hope. The trees were growing back, the streams reflected the golden light of spring, and fresh tracks had appeared in the damp earth, the tracks of a new bear pack. The return of the Guardians. Sarah stood atop a rocky ledge overlooking the valley, where the newly relocated bear pack was exploring their new home. These bears had been carefully selected, rescued from poaching threats and habitat loss in other regions. But not everyone believed in bringing bears back to Pinewood. Michael, now an environmental attorney, stood beside her, his expression tense. "Do you think they'll survive here?" he asked. Sarah smiled, her gaze fixed on the dark shapes moving among the trees. "We prove that this forest can recover," she replied. "So can they." Below them, the bears cautiously stepped into their new territory, sniffing the air, inspecting the land. But it was the alpha, a large black bear, that made Sarah hold her breath. It stood still in the clearing, its amber eyes glowing against the dim forest light. And for a brief moment, it locked eyes with Sarah, just as Shadow had done that night. Sarah felt her heart tighten. "Could it be?" she whispered. Michael followed her gaze. "What is it?" "That bear. It reminds me of Shadow more than any other. A threat from the past, though the preserve was legally protected. Not everyone had given up their greed." 3 days after the bears were reintroduced, Sarah noticed something unusual. One morning, while checking the motion-activated cameras, she found evidence that someone had entered the restricted area. Tire tracks pressed deep into the wet dirt. A steel trap hidden under dry leaves. She clenched her fists. They're back. There was no doubt about it. Poachers had returned. Sarah immediately called Michael and the police, but she couldn't just stand by and wait. She followed the tracks, a deep sense of unease growing inside her. A chase through the woods. The sun was setting, its golden rays piercing through the dense canopy, but Sarah was too focused to admire the view. She was tracking the poachers. Then she heard a noise. Click! She froze. The sound of metal snapping into place. Someone was setting a trap. Sarah lowered herself, moving quietly through the underbrush. Ahead, two men in camouflage clothing were securing a massive bear trap. You sure these bears are worth the risk? Absolutely. Black fur is rare and the claws fetch a high price. Sarah tightened her grip on her phone, recording everything. But she didn't have time to retreat. A twig snapped beneath her boot. Crack! The two men spun around. Who's there? Sarah bolted, tearing through the forest, leaping over fallen logs and pushing past branches. But the footsteps behind her were closing in fast. I want to outrun them. Then, a massive shadow appeared. The arrival of the alpha, a huge black bear, stepped out of the darkness. It stood tall, its amber eyes glowing, muscles tensed in warning. The poachers skidded to a halt, their faces going pale. Back away! Slowly. But before they could react, the bear roared, the sound echoing through the valley. Sarah knew instantly. This was the alpha of the new pack, and it was protecting her. The poachers turned and fled, vanishing into the trees, leaving behind their unfinished traps. Sarah stood there, breathing hard, staring at the bear who held her gaze. It took a slow step forward, its eyes filled with something strangely familiar. An understanding, a silent promise. And Sarah suddenly realized Shadow was gone, but his spirit still remained. In this forest, in this new pack, and in the amber eyes of the alpha standing before her. The legacy of the Guardians. When Michael and the police arrived, Sarah had all the evidence needed to bring the poachers to justice. But more importantly, she knew that the bears were no longer alone. For the first time in years, Sarah felt at peace. She knew that this forest had new guardians now, and she would always be here to protect them, just as they had protected her. Shadow's legacy would live on forever. The lessons of Shadow. Protecting what matters in the modern world, in a world where progress often comes at the expense of nature. Sarah's story reminds us of an undeniable truth. We are not separate from the wild. We are part of it. Her bond with Shadow and the bear pack was not just a connection between a human and an animal. It was a reminder that all living beings share the same earth, the same struggles, and the same right to exist. The fight for conservation, just like the Shadow Bear Wilderness Preserve, many of the world's last wild places are under constant threat. Deforestation, illegal poaching, pollution, and corporate greed continue to push wildlife to the edge of extinction. For every shadow who once roamed freely, there are countless bears, wolves, and other animals struggling to survive in a world that seems to have forgotten them. But Sarah's journey teaches us that change is possible. It starts with awareness, learning about the ecosystems that sustain life. It requires courage to stand against industries that prioritize profit over preservation. And above all, it demands action, whether through supporting wildlife conservation, reducing our environmental impact, or speaking out against destruction. The power of a single voice. Sarah was just one person. Yet, by taking a stand, by refusing to ignore what was happening to the land and the animals she loved, she inspired an entire town to protect its natural heritage. In today's world, it can feel overwhelming to make a difference. But history proves that movements always begin with a single voice. A group of scientists fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest. Local communities resisting corporate pollution in their rivers and air. Activists ensuring that endangered species get the legal protection they need. Like Sarah, each of us has a choice, to ignore what's happening or to be the voice that speaks for those who cannot speak for themselves. A shared future. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Sarah's journey with Shadow is this. When we protect nature, we protect ourselves. The forests that shelter bears, wolves, and elk also provide the air we breathe. The rivers that flow through wilderness preserves also feed our crops and drinking water. By honoring our connection to the wild, we are not just saving the past, we are securing the future. Shadow's legacy lives on not just in the preserve that bears his name, but in every effort made to protect the natural world. And just like Sarah, we must ask ourselves, what legacy will we leave behind? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.